Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent reading, and this is going to be another one with no theme. First up, I have Red Rosa, which is a graphic biography of Rosa Luxemburg, the early 20th century socialist writer and kind of revolutionary agitator, I guess. That sounds negative, and I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. This was written and drawn by Kate Evans, whose Thread from the Refugee Crisis I talked about a while ago. Unlike that book, which was full color, this is a black and white book. This is an interesting book in that I think it is very well done for a couple of very specific audiences, and then I had a couple of minor concerns that kept me from thinking that this was quite as brilliant as some of the people I've seen talk about this have thought. I will say, first of all, if you know nothing about Rosa Luxemburg, I think this is a fantastic introduction to both her and her work and her philosophy and her life and the social space in which she lived and moved through. If you are interested in any of those things and you are completely new to that, I think this does a really good job. I also think if in addition to that you are not used to reading comics format material, because this is so much more wordy than most comics format books are, I think this is a good introduction because a lot of people who are reading their first comic aren't necessarily used to reading the illustrations. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the appeal of comics and maybe going to read understanding comics if you don't read a lot of comics, I think that is a skill one needs to build up. But this is so wordy that at a certain level it almost doesn't matter. Now, having said that, I also think that's a bit of a flaw of this book. There are a couple of moments where it really does put the format to work. There's one moment where we see Rosa Luxemburg writing one of her pieces about the proletariat needing to rise up. And as we're seeing her writing on that subject, we also see her housekeeper cooking her food and cleaning up after her. So we do get that little poking at her own class privilege, which you couldn't really do in any other format other than one that is jointly a text and illustrated one. So that was done very well. There was also, right after the death scene, we get a kind of flashback throughout her life that is several pages without words, that is pure illustration, and I thought that was done really fabulously. The illustration style in here is quite detailed, and as I said, it's black and white. The faces are in line with Kate Evans' usual work, which is a little more stylized than her portraiture, and as such I think is maybe not going to be to everyone's taste, but as I said, this is so wordy that it almost doesn't matter. You could, with a few exceptions, you could read this like a text and not an illustrated book, and unlike with a lot of comics, I don't think you lose that much from that. So this is both a pro and a con. I don't think it makes maximum use of the format, but when it does quite well. Now for me, the biggest issue that I had with this, and this is overall minor, but it is kind of an issue in terms of how a lot of leftist political spaces are missing a specific part of this discussion. So I'm going to put this book down because I want to gesture as I talk about this. All of the first places that I had read about Rosa Luxemburg were coming out of people who were writing from a disability rights or disability justice perspective. A lot of authors in that field who are creating the field of critical disability studies wrote pieces, both think pieces and like short fiction, about Rosa Luxemburg as this major socialist figure who was also a disabled woman. And Kate Evans goes in here and does talk about how Rosa Luxemburg was born with congenital hip dysplasia and had a leg length difference. But after the childhood, it's not really mentioned, and it's still there visually, but in a way that I think is played down a little bit. And then in the notes, you read that Kate Evans' comment is, but it wasn't disabling, which is playing into a medical model of disability, which is definitely not the critical disability studies model of disability. Now, why does that matter? This is a political biography, right? And I think it matters because that is part of this political sphere, and to brush that off, and not just with Luxemburg herself, but also one of her associates / lovers was probably on the autism spectrum, and he is dealt with in the notes in a similar way that is very, well, this wasn't really disabling, but that is not the way one talks about disability if you're using the social model. And if you're using a medical model, that's regressive. And why are you using a regressive model in a book that's about a socialist figure and that you are presumably writing for an audience that is going to be, let's say, progressive in a lot of other ways? And I think, you know, this is a frustration when you read a lot of kind of material that's aimed at a leftist audience, is that disability kind of gets brushed away to the side. And when you're talking about a major disabled figure, it is really disappointing to see that. So I think this is a great biography. I think this is successful on a number of levels, but as someone who essentially first knew who Rosa Luxemburg was because I had read about her from people who were writing about her from a disability perspective, it is really disappointing to see that element of her life framed in such a regressive way. So, yeah, it's a good biography, but I have reservations about a couple of things, but I am aware that not everyone is going to be reading it through the framework that I am, so it is very likely to serve a lot of people's purposes, and you will probably not be irritated by some of the same things that I was. So, there we go. Jumping 100 years forward in time and talk about some different, not quite political commentary, social commentary, I guess. Next up, I picked up Semezdin Mehmedinović's 9 Alexandrias. This was translated by Ammiel Alcalay, who I have talked about before. I'll link to a video where I talked about both Alcalay's own work and his translation of Mehmedinović's Sarajevo Blues. Similarly to Sarajevo Blues, this is essentially a journal in the form of poetry. About 2/3 of this is poetry that recounts a trip that the author took starting in Alexandria, Virginia, and crossing the United States with stops at 9 different cities that are called Alexandria. And he was taking this trip in late September 2001. And part of what he is commenting on that sits in the periphery is that this is in the immediate aftermath of the kind of US cultural turning point of 9/11. And so some of it is the commentary of being somebody who is going to be perceived on appearance as here is a white European man with a very Muslim name. And so there is commentary about that, as well as kind of the moving of here are these 9 Alexandrias. The final third is about living in Alexandria, Virginia, and kind of the thoughts on exile. At this point, the author had been living in the US for about 6 years, and he has actually moved back to Sarajevo now. He doesn't live in the US anymore, but at this point, he didn't know if he would ever move back. And so there is a lot of reflection on exile and what that means in terms of his son, who was about 10 years old when they moved there, and he quotes quite a bit from Mahmoud Darwish, whose poetry I was talking about last week. So conversations around exile and conversations around that kind of identity pieces that get touched on, as well as the travel and everything. This was right up my alley. I don't know if it will be for everybody, because this is the type of poetry that is not tied to rhyme or meter or anything like that. And I know some people don't like poetry at all, or they like poetry when it's strictly formatted, and this is not that. But it dealt with a lot of subjects that I was very interested in. I also, during the time that I lived in the US, I did live in Arlington, Virginia for 2 years, which is just above Alexandria, so I'm familiar with the areas that he was talking about as well. So I loved this. Whether you like it will depend on your attitudes towards poetry and the specific cultural commentary, but I thought this was fantastic. And the final book that I finished was the 3rd volume in Sujata Massey's Perveen Mistry series, which are a series of mysteries set in 1920s India, where the sleuth is Bombay's first female solicitor. This is the Bombay Prince, and it covers a period during which Prince Edward of England, the one who would eventually abdicate, is touring and riots are happening, and a murder has happened, and the question is, was it related to the riots? Was it not? Was it political? Was it personal? Drama ensues. I really enjoy this series. It has the perfect balance of kind of suspense building, character pieces. There is a light romantic plot that is continuing from the second one, but it is very peripheral, which I enjoy because I really dislike when mysteries decide they want to become a romance, and like, no, I do not want 50% romance in a mystery. 10% acceptable. So I enjoyed that bit. It does a lot of kind of socio-cultural and political commentary in a way that manages for a fair amount of nuance, but without being too lectury, because there are definitely some mysteries that are trying a little too hard to be edutainment, and this doesn't do that. It balances itself out pretty well. Like, there are a few sections where I think to a certain extent it helps that the main character has a very religiously and ethnically diverse circle within both the people she's friends with and her household staff, which means there are a lot of moments where people can explain things in a way that doesn't sound ridiculous, because there are a lot of books of this type where you have characters who are there to ask really obvious questions, which becomes a little eye-rolly because that's clearly what they're there for, but the way the kind of cast of characters works lets this do that without it being eye-rolling, which I think is really difficult to do, because I've seen so many books lately that are trying to do something similar to this and do it in a way that's not, that just doesn't feel natural. And I think this isn't maybe 100% perfect, but it is about as close to doing that as well as it can without anybody sounding like a walking encyclopedia. Now, because this is the third book of the series, I can't say a lot about the character stuff because there are, as I said, follow-ups. If you have enjoyed the first two books in that series, I think you'll enjoy that too. I was very pleased, because I always worry with these mysteries, eventually they will hit a point where they're also same that you don't care anymore, and that hasn't done that, and it also hasn't gone the too close to edutainment route that a lot of historical mysteries do, so 2 thumbs up for that one. I'm also taking part in Mark from Book Time with Elvis's reading Euro football reading fun group thing. Reading challenge, something like that. For the group rounds, I had pulled Russia, so I was reading Guzel Yakhina's Zuleikha, which I have not finished. I really enjoyed the first third of this. It's about a Tatar woman who is basically, it's the early 30s, and she doesn't have a great life on the farm. Her husband and her mother-in-law are a little abusive, and one day the communists come in and they kill her husband. He has a horse that, you know, they're peasants, but if you want a horse, you're being anti-collectivist. And she's sent off to Siberia, which is horrible, but also lets her essentially redefine her life, which is interesting. But the middle part has gotten a little, I don't know, it's very Russian. I mean, she's, it is very clearly, but there's sort of a romance that's kind of happening between this woman and the man who killed her husband, and I don't love that. I am enjoying the rest of this, and I will finish it eventually. I don't know who translated this. This was translated by Lisa C Hayden. And, like, it is really hard to find Russian books from non-ethnic Russians. Like, this author, like, the character is Tatar. I think this is loosely based on her grandmother's life, so that's good. Anyway, since Russia's out, I'm now supposed to read something from Denmark, so recommend me something short from Denmark, and I will read that. I think I've forgotten something, but we'll include that next time. If you've read any of the stuff that I talked about reading, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.